Imagine you take a tiny fragment of bone, 12,600 years old, pulled from a hillside in Montana. You grind it up, you sequence the DNA inside it, and then you compare that genetic code against every living population on planet Earth. Every tribe, every nation, every isolated island, every mountain village. And out of nearly 8 billion people, only one match comes back. Not Europeans, not East Asians, not anyone you would expect. The answer turned out to be so strange, so geographically impossible, that the geneticists who first saw the result thought their computer had made a mistake. It hadn't. And what that single match revealed is rewriting everything we thought we knew about how human beings actually arrived in the Americas. For more than a century, the story we told ourselves was clean. It was simple. It was easy to put on a museum poster. A group of hunters wearing fur, carrying stone-tipped spears, walked across a frozen land bridge from Siberia into Alaska about 13,000 years ago. They chased mammoths. They spread south. They became everyone. End of story. Roll the credits. The problem is, the credits never rolled. Because the moment scientists started actually reading the DNA inside ancient bones, the entire poster fell off the wall. The bone in question belonged to a small child, a boy, maybe a year and a half old, buried under a layer of red ochre on a ranch in western Montana. His remains were found by accident in 1968 when a construction crew was leveling a hillside. Around him lay more than 100 stone tools and antler shafts, all stained the same deep red. He is the only known burial from the Clovis culture, the people we used to call the first Americans. Scientists named him Anzac, one, after the ranch. And for 46 years, he just sat in a box. Then, in 2014, a team led by a Danish geneticist named Eske Willerslev finally sequenced his genome. What came out of that sequence cracked open a door no one knew was there. Anzac, one, was not, genetically speaking, the ancestor of one group of Native Americans. He was related to almost all of them. From the Arctic Inuit to the tip of Tierra del Fuego, the DNA inside this one Montana child connected to nearly every indigenous population in the Western Hemisphere. He was, in the most literal sense, family to two continents. That part wasn't the shock. The shock came when they widened the comparison. When they ran his genome against populations outside the Americas, against Europeans, Africans, East Asians, Pacific Islanders, everyone. They expected the closest non-American match to be a modern Siberian group, maybe the Chukchi hugging the Bering Strait, maybe the Yakuts deep in the Russian east. What they actually got was a population that, on a map, makes no sense at all. The closest genetic relatives outside the Americas were not on the Pacific coast of Asia. They were not anywhere along the supposed migration route. They were in central Siberia, thousands of kilometers inland, in a region where another ancient skeleton had been found buried near a place called Malta on the shore of Lake Baikal. That boy, the Malta boy, is 24,000 years old, and his DNA carries a signal that doesn't match modern East Asians. It matches, in part, modern Europeans. And it matches, in a much bigger part, Native Americans. Roughly a third of the ancestry of every indigenous person in the Americas comes from this ghost population that once lived deep inside Ice Age Siberia. A people who weren't Asian in the way we use that word today, and weren't European either. A people who, until that genome was read, no one knew had ever existed. Geneticists gave them a name: the ancient North Eurasians. Think about what that means. The first Americans were not just East Asians who walked east. They were a fusion. Somewhere, sometime, deep in the Ice Age, a group of these ancient North Eurasians met a group of East Asian hunter-gatherers, and the children of that meeting eventually became the founding population of two entire continents. Every indigenous American carries pieces of both. The percentages shift from group to group, but the structure holds from Alaska to Patagonia. And here is the part that still makes the hair stand up on the back of geneticists' necks. We have never found the place where that fusion happened. We have never found the people themselves alive, anywhere on Earth. They vanished. The closest things they left behind are a handful of frozen skeletons and the DNA inside their distant grandchildren on the other side of an ocean. But the story doesn't stop there, because in 2015, just a year after the Anzac paper, another team ran a different comparison. They looked at the genomes of certain Amazonian peoples in Brazil, the Suruí, the Caritiana, the Zavante, and in their DNA, in a small but unmistakable signal, they found something that should not be there. A trace, faint but real, of a population whose closest living relatives are not in Siberia at all. They are in Australia, in Papua New Guinea, on islands in the Andaman Sea, indigenous peoples of the South Pacific. There is a small but statistically solid genetic echo of Australasians inside the rainforest tribes of the Amazon. They called this mystery ancestor Population Y from the Tupi word for ancestor Waipaquera. To this day, no one can fully explain how that signal got there. Did a small group of Australasian-related people cross the Pacific in some forgotten era? Did they ride a coastline that no longer exists, hugging the edge of the ice sheets, slipping into the Americas before Anzac, one's ancestors, arrived? Or did the fusion happen somewhere deep in Asia, with one branch then traveling east while the rest of the family stayed put? The honest answer is, we don't know. We just know that the rainforest holds a fingerprint of an ocean. So back to the original headline. Scientists compared the DNA of the first Americans to every population on Earth, and only one matched. Which one? It depends on how you ask the question. If you ask, who is the closest living overall match to Anzac, one, and to the ancient founders of the Americas? The answer is a small group of indigenous Siberians living around the Yenisei River in a remote corner of central Russia. They are called the Kets. There are fewer than 1,200 of them left. Their language is a true isolate. It doesn't fit any major Asian language family. It has no obvious relatives anywhere on Earth, except, intriguingly, possible deep connections to the Na-Dene languages of North America, the family that includes Navajo and Apache. The Kets fish for sturgeon. They tell stories of a shamanic past that's slipping away with every elder who passes. And inside their cells, they carry the largest share of ancient North Eurasian ancestry of any population still walking the planet. They are, in a real and measurable way, the last living kin of the lost people who, 20,000 years ago, helped give rise to everyone from the Inuit to the Mapuche. One match. 1,200 people, a language no one else speaks, a bloodline that crossed an ocean of ice and never came back. Now, you might be thinking, hang on, what about the rest? What about the famous Bering land bridge story? Did that just get thrown out? Not exactly. It got refined. It got complicated in the way real history always is, the moment you actually look. The land bridge was real. It existed. For thousands of years during the last glacial maximum, sea levels were so low that Alaska and Siberia were one continuous landmass called Beringia, a country the size of modern Mongolia, with its own climate, its own animals, its own ecology. People did live there. The current picture from genetics is that the ancestors of Native Americans got stuck on that land bridge, trapped. The ice sheets to the east were impassable, the cold to the west brutal, so they sat. For something like 10 to 15,000 years, an isolated population the geneticists call the Beringian standstill held in place, breeding among themselves, drifting genetically away from everyone else in Asia, becoming something new. And then, when the ice finally cracked open, they poured south. Some of them walked an inland corridor between the melting glaciers. Others, almost certainly, paddled along the kelp highway of the Pacific coast, hopping from one rich estuary to the next, eating shellfish and seals, moving faster than any walking pace would allow. They reached the southern tip of South America in what, by archaeological standards, is the blink of an eye. But every time we drill into a site that's old enough, we find traces of something we can't quite explain. Footprints in white sands, New Mexico, dated to 23,000 years ago, long before the land bridge story says anyone should have been there. Stone tools at Monte Verde in Chile, 14,500 years old, far older than the Clovis culture in North America, a child's tooth from a cave in Yucatan, a genome from a 13,000-year-old skeleton in a flooded sinkhole. Each one adds a complication. Each one suggests that the peopling of the Americas was not one wave, but many. Not one route, but several. Not one population, but a braided river of populations, weaving in and out across 10 or 15,000 years of ice, water, and uncertain coastline. And every single one of those streams seems to carry, in some proportion, a trace of those vanished people, the ancient North Eurasians, the ghost on Lake Baikal. Why does any of this matter? Why should you care about a child buried in red ochre on a Montana hillside, or a small fishing community on a Siberian river, or a faint Australasian whisper inside an Amazonian genome? Because every one of these findings rips a hole in the smug, simple version of human history that we used to teach. We used to draw arrows on a map. One arrow from Africa, one arrow from Siberia, one arrow into the Americas, clean, reassuring, wrong. The real story of how we got here is messier, weirder, and far more interesting. It's a story of small groups meeting in places we will probably never identify, of bands of hunters surviving winters we can barely imagine, of fusion populations that lasted long enough to leave their DNA in 2 continents and then disappeared so completely that we needed a particle of bone and a supercomputer to even know they were ever there. It's a story of people doing the most human thing there is, walking until the land ran out and then finding a way to walk further. And it raises questions we still cannot answer. Who exactly were the ancient North Eurasians? What did they look like? What did they believe? What did their voices sound like? We have a few skeletons. We have a Venus figurine carved from mammoth ivory in their old camp at Malta. We have flint tools and bone needles and the burial of that one small boy, but we don't have their names. We don't have their songs. We have only the fact that when we line up a Montana toddler from 13,000 years ago and a Ket fisherman from last week, the same lost grandparents are looking back at us through both of them. That is what the DNA actually said. That is the only match the computer kept returning. And the more we sequence, the louder that signal becomes. There's also a quieter, harder truth running underneath all of this. For a long time, indigenous communities in the Americas told the scientists studying them in their own ways and in their own languages that the textbook version was wrong, that their oral histories went back further than 13,000 years, that they had not just walked in over a single bridge, that there were many origins, many directions, many older stories. And for a long time, that knowledge was dismissed as myth. It turns out the myth was the textbook. And it turns out the genomes, when we finally bothered to read them, were telling something much closer to what those communities had been saying all along. So if you take one thing away from this, take this. The story of who we are is unfinished. Every year, another ancient skeleton gets sequenced. Every year, another faint signal pops up in a place it shouldn't be. Every year, the simple version cracks a little more. And every year, the picture that emerges is more honest about what we actually are. A species of restless walkers, a species of mixers, of crossers, of people who do not stay put. A species whose blood carries the memory of journeys we no longer remember taking. If this kind of story is the kind you can't stop thinking about, the kind that makes you stare a little longer at a map, the kind that makes you wonder whose voice is sleeping inside your own cells, then stick around. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Hit the like button if you want more videos that go past the textbook and into the parts of human history that are still being written. And down in the comments, tell me one thing. If a sample of your DNA, just yours, was compared against every population on Earth, where do you think your one match would come from? The country you live in? The country your grandparents came from? Or somewhere you never expected, somewhere you've never even been, where a small group of strangers carries a piece of the same ancient signal you do? Because that's the strange, beautiful, slightly unsettling lesson the first Americans left us. Sometimes, the closest thing to home is a place you've never seen,